Insert "do you bleed? My wallet will" comment right here. Arguably the figure that I was looking forward towards the most when McFarlane was tackling the BVS line again after a little bit of a dry spell when it came to DC films for the remainder of 2024. And it makes sense because things are kind of in the gutter right now when it comes to superhero movies, as I touched on before. But the funny thing is that I feel like we kind of touched upon this prospect of a Batman figure before, only with maybe some necessary modifications to fit the lore and the extraction, if you will, from the Batman vs. Superman movie property. And it's definitely a version of Batman that we haven't seen him tackle before, but the reason for why I was looking forward to it the most is because this is arguably going to be a wheelhouse for McFarlane as far as paint applications, sculpting, and it looks like he's taking things that he's learned in the past couple of months as far as anting up the premium quality or the packing material for the solid build of a figure when it comes to individual releases. Because amongst BVS, we have 2-packs, we have mega figures, we have double packs, etc. But when it came to the standalone stuff, this is the one that I was looking forward to the most because I can see just an awful lot of things building up from some prior releases. One in particular that's not necessarily tied to Batman vs. Superman, but rather to a property that BVS took inspiration from. But before we get to that eventual comparison, here is the Ben Affleck Batman from Batman vs. Superman donning the armored suit, ready to take on the Man of Steel. And of course, you could see the inspiration from a specific Frank Miller comic, except adorned to look like he does in-universe for the Zack Snyder universe, or the Zack Snyder take. And this is why I was hyped, because you can see just how well they're able to not only replicate the armor as far as the bulkiness, as far as the almost exaggeration of proportions, but in a necessary kind of way, in a needed kind of way. You know, obviously the suit has to be bigger to be able to take a punch from Superman himself. But here is where I was looking forward to this figure the most, is because we've seen time and time again throughout the years that McFarlane absolutely adores doing anything that has to do with brush metal, anything that has to do with armor pieces, anything that has to do with any kind of alloy in terms of the sculpting, in terms of the battle damage, and frankly, and I know that this is a very ironic point that a lot of you are probably going to scoff at, paint applications. Because when it comes with individual paint applications that are a bit more on the vibrant and diverse side for the color wheel, that's where we definitely have our criticisms with McFarlane kind of pulling back on things, kind of overlooking them and not really bothering them to make sure to keep costs down, etc. But when a figure is donning some kind of suit of armor, whether it just be in the DC Multiverse line or frankly for his own toy line of Spawn figures, he goes all out. That's the stuff that you can definitely tell tickles his fancy. So whenever we get some kind of armorized Batman, you can rest assured that that thing is going to look pretty damn accurate. And this version of the armorized Batman is no exception. Just marvel at the paint applications for the silver, the airbrush quality or the airbrush pass they gave it to make it look very brushed, to make it look kind of weathered and damaged. And I'll pull myself from utilizing hyperbole like realistic, but as far as a 7-inch figure, goddamn, just look at, like I said, some paneling for the armor, specifically around the chest area, the abdomen, and to me, the more robotic nature and approach to the legs. I would argue that the legs are probably my favorite part. It almost kind of bears resemblance to that of a suit, a Brotherhood of Steel suit from the Fallout franchise, which is kind of appropriate considering that he did some of the Fallout pre-post figures that were released recently in collaboration with the show, which almost made me argue, why couldn't you give us a articulated mecha suit? But I feel like there's probably some other company out there with a license for that. So here's probably the next best thing. The boxy look to the legs, the way that it's sculpted out with the paneling, the airbrush metal, it looks legitimately awesome and really worth the purchase in terms of what you're getting as far as one-to-one representation. The only thing that kind of stands out to me a little strange, though I believe it is technically movie accurate, but still, it kind of threw me for a loop, are these gold accents amongst the spikes on the side. I definitely understand the ones that are on the gauntlets and on the arms because it's very, customary for Batman. And even though gold touches on the airbrush look to the utility belt right there. But it's really the ones that are on the side of the legs that I'm looking at and going, okay, that's actually kind of strange. I don't really remember that. But at the same time, during that scene, I really wasn't looking at his feet. I was looking exactly on how well they were able to capture an awful lot of the Dark Knight Returns influence, and the figure is really not doing that much different, specifically with the little buckle and strap across the chest here. Again, like I mentioned before, the arms, you still see a little bit of that classic kind of wrinkled texture to kind of make the pieces look like they're conjoined via an undersuit around the crotch, elbow areas, and even a little bit around the biceps. But then, of course, the thing that you really need to be able to nail to bring this suit home is the head sculpt, which of course has that much more Dark Knight Returns influence with the glowing eyes. The jury can still be out for the Affleck resemblance, but at the same time, when you have such a big helmet version of the cowl here, does it really matter that much? Does it really make that much of a difference? And you can see that I really can't pinpoint exactly if that looks like Affleck or not, but I feel like here there's enough sculpting happening around said mouth plate that I feel like it really doesn't matter. At least me personally don't care that much. What I do care about is this cape. Look at this thing. I love it. I'm sorry. I know it's not necessarily the most stylized, badass cape there is in terms of pattern, in terms of color scheming, and sure, I would have liked it a little bit on the darker side. I do think that the hue for gray that they went here is a little bit too bluish. It almost kind of reminds me of the problems we had with that original BVS suit that came out earlier this year, as far as the bluish tint instead of giving us a much more natural gray, except this time I feel like, if I remember correctly in the movie, this cape is supposed to be simply just a darker, almost kind of jet black. But in terms of the texture, damn, it's almost 1-to-1. They even got an awful lot of the rippage and tattering that we have going on here towards the end, because it actually was, in fact, a very tattered cape towards the end rim right here. But on top of that, it's wired and it's a legitimate cloth cape. So no nylon fabrics, it's cloth. It's not necessarily double stitched, it's a little bit on the thinner side. But again, funny enough, I feel like at the expense of not sacrificing lore, it fits the character, because when he assembled this suit, I feel like he did it in a very quick way that he really wasn't focusing on how badass the cape really looked. So he just kind of strapped a bit of a rag on to make it to make it look like a cape. And they got that kind of atmosphere down when it comes to this cloth cape attached. Now, I do kind of wish that the wire was a little bit on the stronger side, but the fact that we have a wire at all here at the outer rims to be able to stylize the cape, and it's actually wide enough and long enough to give it a variety of a style to make it even more badass and cool looking, is simply just awesome. I really like this. This, again, adds to the value of the figure, and coupling it with the sculpting as far as the airbrush look to the overall paint applications for the suit, I'm telling you, this is slowly but surely becoming my favorite out of this wave thus far. And the articulation, thankfully, doesn't do anything to kind of dissuade that, minus just a couple of grievances here and there. One of which is, in fact, the head sculpt, because even though it's able to slightly turn left and right, it really is that collar that kind of gets in the way of the really large head sculpt that needed to be that big because of the way that the helmet is designed. But unfortunately, it came at the sacrifice of a good amount of articulation when it comes to rotating. It does have a little bit of room within the neck peg joint inside to allow some tilting up like so, and even some tilting down, but it's not the most favorable. You kind of have to like shift the head in place forward and back to allow some of that to even happen in the first place. But even when you get it to like its most maximum angle, you really can't get it to flush all that much as you would have desired. And you could practically forget about any kind of tilting side to side, as you can see right there. It virtually doesn't even really happen. And the top arms are almost the same. There's technically a joint that allows the arm to be able to rotate vertically 360 no problem. But you can see right here that they got these shoulder pieces sculpted and attached to the top of the shoulder as opposed to the bicep like they've done with prior McFarlane figures I've definitely seen firsthand. And that's unfortunate because this completely nulls and voids said articulation for the rotation. It can happen. The joint is in there. But when you do so, you'll notice that it's flexing the rubberized shoulder plate. And you can see that it's kind of bending and warping, and eventually it's going to come into contact. So you can technically lift this all the way up, but of course, every time you do that, you come at the risk of warping and damn near damaging the rubberized pieces of plastic inside here holding the shoulder piece in place. And therefore, extension towards the sides is no problem, but it definitely stops at the 90-degree angle. and there's no kind of butterfly movement that I can really find, or even any kind of shrugging, so you could practically forget about that. But what really hurts me the most is the vertical rotation, because the joint is there, but it's this piece right here that we've seen them modify to be attached to the biceps before, and the fact that they didn't do that here, it's a little puzzling to me. What's even more puzzling is that you get a double form of swivel action within the arms, because you technically do have a bicep swivel, but then you have an elbow swivel, kind of similar to another armorized Batman that we'll tackle momentarily. But you can see here that you have a little bit of a swivel there on the bicep that is most fluid on the left as opposed to the right, but technically it can be found there on both. And then you have another swivel at the top of the elbow right above the hinge that bends at the 90-degree angle. So they decided to do that thing that they've done before with bulkier figures, where they don't give you two joints to bend at the elbow, but rather a swivel to rotate horizontally, as you can see right there, and bend at a 90-degree just once right about right there. So that's only as far as it goes. And you do have the ball joint here at the wrist that allows the hand to fully rotate and slightly bend inwards and outwards, but at the same time the cuff is thick enough that it kind of limits the mobility of being able to bend the wrist in and out. Now, being an armorized Batman, one of my key concerns was going to be this center portion for the mid-torso, because generally armorized characters don't have the best articulation in the mid-waist area, but a little surprising for Armored Batman, though not as best as it could have been, because rotation definitely happens at the mid-torso cut all the way around 360 and can definitely extend towards the back pretty generously for an armorized Batman. You can see right there, it's kind of flexing back. Doesn't really crunch forward, however, all that much. If you want to crunch forward even further, you rely a little bit more on the waist joint that does flex forward a little better and slightly more towards the back, as you can kind of see it right about right there, and even side to side. But it's also, actually, no, never mind. You can definitely rotate at the waist 360 as well. So you have double rotation. So you can see that that is actually a bit more complementary than I was expecting for an armorized character such as this. Legs can flex towards the top, again, pretty well, despite the diaper piece. They can definitely flex almost at the full 90-degree angle to kind of give that kick that he did to Superman in the movie, which was borderline unrealistic considering the amount of armor he's wearing, but still, it's there. It looks badass. Zack Snyder liked it, so there it is. It's in the movie. He likes it. But extending towards the back here, you can see that it's not too bad, but it starts to veer off towards the sides instead of being a straight shooter, so just be mindful of that. And extending towards the sides, as far as the even splits, can definitely happen actually a full 90-degree. I knew it could get close, but I didn't know that it could almost do the full flat splits right about right there, even in an armorized suit. Now, to me, what really stood out to me as far as a good form of articulation, despite the sculpting, that I thought to myself, okay, they need to be able to nail this. And if they do, the legs are easily my favorite part of this entire ensemble, this entire piece. And that's got to be the knee joints, which definitely flex all the way up at both joints right there, no problem. So cool to see that the sculpting looks badass, looks mechanized, and can still allow it to bend all the way up, no problem. And though they are boasting the ball joints instead of the flush joints that I like for the much more contemporary McFarlanes, they still allow the foot and the ankle to fully rotate 360, no problem, and slightly nudge up and down. Just be mindful of the pieces because of how thick and massive they are. They're gonna be kind of coming into contact with each other, so they kind of stop a little shorter than your traditional McFarlane. But even with the big ass boots right here, and even the very prickly and rather hurtful spikes that he's got going on here on the treads of the soles of his feet, still got the toes. Just be mindful of the damage you're gonna take when bending them, because you can see right there that the spikes really imprint on your thumb, and you got to be careful with them because they legitimately hurt. But when you do so, toes flex all the way up like that. So you can see great sculpting, paint work, really surprising articulation. The figure could practically stand for himself, both figuratively and literally. But at the same time, from seeing that sequence in BVS, and trust me, a lot of us watched it over and over again, even when we skipped the majority of the movie and we simply just watched that one fight on YouTube, because, come on, stop looking at me like that. You're guilty too. We didn't bother with the movie, but we watched that scene many times on YouTube because of so many channels reposting it over and over. And when you watch it back, you'll see that he didn't just take on Superman by himself with the suit. He had an array of accessories and tricks up his sleeve. But for some reason, McFarlane opted to not include them on the standalone release. I understand that some of them couldn't be done because of certain legal troubles, hurdles he had to go over. But I would still make the argument that a couple could still have been included even without violating any of that stuff. And yet on the side, all we really got were an extra pair of hands. Yeah, because by default, he's got gripping hands that kind of give us the impression that he was meant to hold something in there. But the standalone release doesn't bother with that. And I feel like a little bit of scumminess is in fact happening there that I do have to call out. And frankly, we have evidence of that blatantly with some secondary gold label releases that we'll tackle on the channel momentarily. But for now, within the box for the standalone $22.99 release, you just get an alternate pair of hands to be able to swap them out with. On the right, we have this kind of extending, somewhat gestating open hand. And then on the left, the fist, which I'm going to have to look it up and see if Ben Affleck is left-handed, because if I had it my way, I would have preferred the fist to be on the right hand. But if you're going to be kind of holding back on some of those other accessories that I could make the argument could still have been included, I would have doubled down on the fists, doubled down on the open hands and the gripping hands so that there's variety, there's options. Because frankly, to have this be it, yes, the suit is sculpted and painted wonderfully. The articulation is pretty surprising. The cloth cape is chef's kiss. It's one of the things that really brings this down to being my favorite out of the wave thus far. But I still think that an argument could have been made for the accessories. Now, granted, he's not the only armorized Batman that only came with a set of hands, and that was it. But at the time, the costs were a little bit on the lower side. They would often go for only about $20. And this figure in particular would become one of the staple peg warmers with vast array of inventory across several different retailers: Amazon, Best Buy, Target, Walmart. You can find them anywhere. And I want to bring him in here because I almost want to make the argument that this guy was utilized as the blueprint. And that's, of course, what I like to call the McFarlaneized Dark Knight Returns armored Batman that you can see right here. Come on, tell me that you did not see this guy virtually everywhere when you were hunting back in 2021. Like I said, you will find him even in some of the unlikelier retailers, like I said, Best Buy and even Ross, I think a couple of times, maybe even DD's Discounts. And here's the extra pair of hands that he comes with. And at the time, we really didn't think twice as to whether or not he should have come with extra hands, because we were still trying to see and gauge where McFarlane was going to be at with the DC Multiverse wave, with the line or the property in general. And so delivering on a Dark Knight Returns armored Batman that takes inspiration from the version that we saw in the comics, specifically with just how robust and I almost want to say antiquated the approach to the suit really is, to the point where he doesn't even have any of that mid-torso articulation, but it's just all one giant plate here for the chest and the abdomen. Of course, it's a bit more plain and barren as far as the gauntlets, the shoulder platings, the crotch plate right there to protect the family jewels. But then, of course, the clothy look to the suit that he's wearing underneath to hold everything together. It's like I said, it's got a much more robust, very antiquated, very just bare bones kind of look. But it's kind of faithful to the way that it looked like in the comic, though not a one-to-one representation. Still has a little bit of that McFarlaneized style to it, the way that McFarlane tackled Batman Beyond, the way that he tackled animated series Batman, where he tried to like blend both styles together, his own style, his own McFarlaneized DC Multiverse style, and then whatever that property comes from. In this case, Dark Knight Returns, the comic version. But I'd be lying if I'd said that I didn't think about this figure when this guy was announced and thought to myself, did they take anything from this guy to make this guy work and kind of revise on it? Obviously, the cloth cape is probably the most obvious difference because we're still dealing with rubberized over here. Even though I really appreciate the texture work on said rubberized cape, it's still rubberized cape. Whereas over here, we got premium quality cloth, even though I would have preferred it to be double stitched. But still, you got the wire, you got the rims, you got the tattered look. It's immaculate. But outside of that, did they do anything to kind of build off of that? And ever so often, I see, the term that I often like to use, DNA that kind of bleeds from one to the other. For me personally, it would have to be those areas where you see a little bit of that undersuit, that clothy area, specifically around the elbows, biceps, crotch, and diaper piece, where I see just a little bit of that. And like I said, not a one-to-one repaint or pull through where they just kind of 3D printed the same pieces and just retooled it. No, they definitely built on it. They probably added some extra layers of plastic and rubberized quality coating to it and then repainted it. But I see, just like I said, little bit of a family resemblance within this tree. So if Armorized Batman from BVS were to take a 23andMe, there would be a little bit of the Dark Knight Returns armor Batman found somewhere in there. And even when it came to the complaint I had about the accessories, you could see that even the hands kind of look almost identical. The gesture's the same for the extending one. You got the fist hand, which this time it came on person by default with the Dark Knight Returns version. But it's almost one-to-one, minus, like I said, some restructuring and remolding of the panels there on top of his hands. And everything else, like I said, if I squint hard enough, I can see it. But there's still enough of a change that I can render this as a separate figure. But it definitely has some kind of familial tie to the Dark Knight Returns. And I feel like this guy needed to walk so that BVS Armored Batman can run into becoming my favorite out of the wave. As far as the paint applications, the way that they were able to chisel out the boxy look to the arms and the legs, the abdomen, and then being able to, again, incorporate just a little bit more of articulation, though some of it fell a little bit kind of redundant with the repetition of swivels around the biceps and the elbows, and then lacking a little bit of it with the neck, as well as, like I said, the paneling. Even over here, you can technically still rotate the arms vertically because the panels for the shoulder guards are on the actual shoulder themselves as opposed to the top of the chest. So that's one thing that even the Dark Knight Returns version has over the current BVS. But man, I'm able to be spoken to a little bit more positively by the likeness to that armorized suit, the cloth cape, the sheer quality behind the paint apps. It's really doing it for me. It still manages to stay within an 8 out of 10 territory, but it's a very, 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 very high 8 out of 10. Teetering on 9 if maybe, like I said, they could have done something about the articulation at the top part here, anything that involves either the head or the shoulders, or maybe tossed in an extra couple of accessories that didn't get kind of, for lack of a better term, paywalled behind exclusivity. I mean, I can think of the spear instantly could have been tossed in here, or maybe a grapple hook that he utilized to swing Superman around. You know, a couple of things right there, right at the top of my noggin that I can look at and go, hey, none of that stuff is gun related. It's not firearm related. You don't have to lock it behind the 17 plus. Could have tossed it in here, and instead it was bypassed for, like I said, exclusivity, and that definitely needs to be called out. But this is still a very immaculate effort that, in my opinion, if you were to ask me what's your definitive armorized Batman, I would honestly say that maybe this guy has been dethroned for the BVS version. But maybe those sentiments will change over time. For now, I want to hear what your guys' sentiments are as far as the armorized version of Batman. Do you guys feel the same way that I think that there is a little bit of shared DNA with the Dark Knight Returns version from 2021 that we would see time and time again, especially at that Walmart in your town that never likes to restock, and they would constantly be having this goddamn thing in there? Let me know down below, and when you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button to help the video out in the algorithm. However, if you did enjoy the video, hit the thumbs down. And as always, I appreciate you guys. Stay humble, and I'll catch you later.